Okay, hello. Today I'm with Ben Spatz, and we're in different places, obviously, because Ben is in Huddersfield and I'm at home. And Ben is the author of a really influential 2015 book called "What a Body Can Do." And I haven't been teaching this book. I've been using this book in my teaching. I've been using this book in my research. So, and I know that a lot of other people have been using this book because it's had a very, very wide impact, a very broad impact, in all sorts of different disciplines. So we're going to start from that and talk about Ben's ongoing work as well, and stuff around body and image and technology and exercise and dance and movement and embodied research. And hello, Ben, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you expecting this book to be as influential, as important and influential as it has been? Were you expecting this stuff?
No, not at all. I mean, and thank you for saying that. No, I've been quite amazed at how it's been taken up. I mean, I did feel like, I mean, as I was writing it, I felt like I was writing something that was essential for me. And I did feel like I was coming from a particular kind of world and speaking to another world. And so I thought maybe this will be useful. Hopefully this can be useful. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who are various kinds of practitioners who work in various kinds of long-term ways, and who then arrive to academia and aren't really presented with tools that get at the substance of what they do. They're presented with a lot of tools that kind of work around it. But so I was proposing it as a toolkit. Like, I hope this is useful.
Yeah.
It's been great that it's been useful.
And it has been. I mean, so we both know Eric Burkhart, and he's a medieval historian, and he researches like questions around what the body can do, what we can know about what bodies were doing, like in the Middle Ages and so on. And he said that before he read your book, he was struggling with old concept from Marcel Mauss, and this just was a complete game changer. It's really clear. The great thing about it is that you can set chapters of it, as I have for my undergraduate students, and they get really excited by it and really into it.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, I think the argument that I pulled out I pulled out lots of different arguments from different parts of your book when I've taught students, but the idea that you propose, the idea of technique as a sort of basic unit of analysis. So this is, I mean, it's not exactly a completely new idea, but it's a really a refinement of the way that people think about the way that we can be influenced across cultures through media in different ways. So was this focus on technique? Would you say that's the core of the book for you?
Yes, I think that is absolutely the core. And there's there was this, I don't know if it was a specific moment, but I had this kind of period where, because while I was writing that book, I mean, the book was a PhD thesis originally at CUNY in New York City. And I was in a situation where I was doing this PhD, and then separately I was working on a kind of cultivating my own practice, which is a theater-based practice, but it's a kind of theater that's been heavily influenced by martial arts, dance, yoga, all of these things. So it's not a typical kind of theater acting process, but it's a work on the self. But because it comes from theater, it also includes possibly more work on association and personal association and stories and all these kinds of things. So I was developing that at the same time, but the worlds were very, very separate. And I was always crossing back and forth between them, sometimes between different parts of the city, sometimes even in the same building, going from one to the other in this very kind of like, it felt right in some way because they're both part of me, but I was navigating this dichotomy, which really is, I mean, on an institutional level, it was the mind-body dichotomy. It was like your body goes over here, you're in the space, you're moving, you're singing, okay, done, over here, and we are living, as the president of the institution said when we joined, now you're in the life of the mind. And so that all goes away. So I was going back and forth constantly, and technique at some point kind of became this touchstone for me, where I was saying, okay, wait, that this is working in both places somehow, because I know that when we're in the studio, and I'm thinking about what we're doing, since we're not making shows in the normal way that you do in theater, and the other kinds of, we're not very focused on this kind of thing, we're just practicing. But how can I get at what we're really doing? And technique is really vital there. But then if I come over to the other side, the PhD, where I'm learning about Marcel Mauss technique, but also habitus, Judith Butler, all of this kind of thing, Foucault, techniques of the self, technologies of the self, all this kind of thinking about what the body is, how is the body layered, sedimented, discipline, control, Saba Mahmoud, the kind of different ways of understanding the layers, the flows of power in the body. This word technique is operating and it's meaningful in both places. And so it can be something that maybe there's a way to use it to open something, a wider channel between these worlds.
Okay, great. So you at the start of that, you talked about the mind-body duality or dichotomy. Now, I have talked to, I've discussed this in lectures with students and in seminars, and it seems to really excite them. A lot of them, so on the module on the body image, the mind body module, on the body image module, a lot of them have proposed to begin their essays from interrogating this binary. I mean, how would you recommend people, my students, your students, think about the mind in relation to the body?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've definitely been thinking about that for a long time. Okay, I mean, what I really would say now is that I think the mind, for me, the mind is a little bit of a red herring. I don't particularly focus on it, and this is another topic which we can get into, and I don't want to make too many strong claims on it, but I don't see in the cognitive approaches quite the importance and centrality that is often given to them, because they are about the mind. For me, the mind is kind of like, I'm not sure what I would want to say about that. I think the body, if we bring it towards embodiment, which is different, that's really important for me. It's really a central concept. And my dear friend and colleague Caroline Gatt has just written a lovely piece in Body and Society, questioning the idea of embodiment. And we're in conversation also about this kind of area of theater making that I mentioned, which is also mentioned in her article. And I think that's part of my thinking about embodiment. Is like, yeah, there are some real limitations that are cultural limitations about the idea of embodiment, because it comes from the idea of the body, because it comes from this Western European mind-body split. So I'm not saying embodiment is kind of the answer or the permanent foundation, but for me, the question is, how do we think about embodiment? What are the ethics and the politics of embodiment? And then from that perspective, I mean, to be honest, the biggest effect that I've encountered in the last few years, the biggest change that I've encountered in my thinking in the last few years, is because of the way that I've changed my thinking about what video is. And one of the reasons why that's been so significant is it's changed my understanding of what writing is. And part of what's happened is that I've come to think that a lot of what we mean by the mind is a bit of an artifact of the technology of writing, which isn't to say that there isn't something else that we could call the mind if we didn't have writing. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as consciousness. What I mean is, when we separate the mind and the body, a lot of that is based on the ubiquity, and not just the ubiquity, but the power, the logocentrism of the technology of writing. And when we talk, when we talk about mind, intellect, or explicit knowledge as opposed to implicit knowledge, or what is conscious, I'm just asking, I mean, I can't make a strong claim about this, but it seems to me that a lot of times Actually, the question we're asking is based on some assumptions about the technology of writing and how it works. And I'm in no way against the technology of writing. I'm a writer primarily in some ways, and that's very important to me. But if you allow video to come into that picture, not as kind of like, oh, now we have video, great, that's nice, but really come into the picture and really say, okay, video also travels now, not quite in the way that writing does. It doesn't travel as easily. It's not as easy to work with video quite as writing, but we're starting to see in the last 10 years of the internet how video could have a kind of massive communication function the way writing does. And if you allow it to come into that position and say, well, video works very differently than writing. So that technology, if we treat video as a kind of thought, really, if we really say maybe that really is a kind of thought, then the whole idea of embodiment has to also change. Because if the mind-body is split, if we're thinking about the body from the perspective of the mind, but by the mind we actually mean writing, then when we think about video and writing as two technologies, then we're coming back to the body and saying, there was never a mind that was separate from the body. What there is embodiment, which is life, which is interacting and intersecting with all other bodies and inanimate things and objects and material flows, and all of this is happening, and we're mixed into this. And there's, in a way, this kind of, there's a lot of writing now about kind of following Latour and coming from other places as well, that the kind of ideas of networks and agencies, material agencies, everything having agency. So you can get to this kind of like, yes, okay, it's almost like everything has agency, everything is alive, everything is moving, everything is changing, there are no fixed categories. Yes, totally, that's obviously true. But then if we're gonna have some, that doesn't, the question is, how does that relate to conversations? And conversations, again, I mean ways of thinking, communication. How does that relate to structures of communication in that sense of the social, not as the kind of the social as something separate, but the social as this layer of communication, a historical thing, which is just no longer written. It's no longer only written. I mean, writing still has a lot of power. There are things that are still only written, like constitutions, legal documents. You write down what are but that's a technology. Like, how should we structure our society? Well, let's write it down. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Obviously, there are ways of doing that without writing. Who can imagine what it would look like to take video seriously in that way? So that's kind of, the first thing I would do would be to say, it's not a binary. It was never a binary. Mind, we can decenter, we can refer to logocentrism in a lot of ways. Let's relook at embodiment. Let's look again at embodiment, but let's also look at how we're looking at embodiment. So when we talk about it, especially now, like we're thinking about universities and teaching in classes, let's examine embodiment. But even in the word examine, do we just mean read about it and write about it? No. Let's also practice. Okay, but then how do we share our practices? Well, we could write about them. Again, always coming back to writing, but there are other possibilities. So if we really take seriously like what it would mean to share that knowledge in video, to structure our practice in relation to video, it's a really active, I don't have answers to that, but it's a really active question for me. And not only video, but for me, video is really, because it's so powerful and it's so different from writing, but it's having these circulations now. It has this power of kind of coming in and bumping out writing in a way and saying, well, what do we actually mean by intellect? What, the idea of the intellect or the life of the mind, this way of, which has a lot to do with distance in a way, like you get distance from society or something, but that's also from the technology of writing, that you would be able to close yourself in a room and do something which then goes out into the world. So if you do that with video, it's completely different kind of distance that you're taking, or less distance, or more, or a different kind of distance. So it's just a way, I'm really interested in video, we can talk more about that, but I don't think that's the only thing that's happening there. But displacing writing, and then from that perspective, from this kind of very complex sphere of network communication and technology, in the context of an ecological crisis, then what is the body? What is embodiment? Becomes a different question.
Okay, so there's just so much in that answer. So if I retrace some of that. Tell me if I'm wrong. So you're saying that the way we think about the mind and body, or the very proposal that there's a mind-body binary, is an effect of the dominance of writing. It's an effect of that media technology. So that means that, for instance, we can say, this thing is, it's literally true that I'm sitting down. We use the word literally to mean physically, but literally means it's literary. It's to do with the written, right? So we conflate, because of the history of writing and the status of words in our culture, we think our mind does that. We ignore the technology, the medium, and we think that there is mind that makes our body to do something. So we imagine a mind which is superior to a body. And you want to displace that onto, well, what happens when we don't live in a logocentric world anymore? So like, yes, there's still a place for writing in the world. Yes, our constitutions are still written, our laws are still written in words. But look at all of the other communication technologies that we exist in, one of which is video, that you're really interested in. And video, again, has been regarded as something kind of trivial or less important than writing. So you're saying it's kind of it's a very deconstructive operation, isn't it? Where you take the supposedly secondary or supposedly inferior and go, no. How can it be? How is this pencil, which isn't in my hand? How is the keyboard? How is that somehow inferior to me when that is the technology that enables the communication, that enables the construction of a sense of meaning, of identity, and so on and so on and so on. So so if you use a different technology, you don't have a mind-body distinction, or it comes out in a different way. So you think that another thing that you propose, I think, in your book, towards the end of the book, which I didn't ask the students to read, and one thing my students don't know, I guess, is that the Journal of Embodied Research is video essays. And one of the premises is that the new media technology, the new audiovisual technology, should enable it, or should facilitate a completely different way of learning and of teaching and of capturing, archiving, studying. And you want to displace words. You don't want to get rid of them. We might need a name badge, or we might need an arrow going, like we might need these maps and these pointers, but we shouldn't subordinate the audiovisual and indeed the body, which can manifest itself in new ways thanks to audiovisual technology.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few things I wanted to pick up on there. So what is the body, or what is thought? What would the mind be? If we're talking about sharing audiovisual materials, I think you're absolutely. I think that I am saying that when that very much, it's not just that we think of a mind, and then when we write, we think that the mind is going there. I think I'm saying that causally, it might even be the other way around, where what we mean by mind is the stuff that can be written. Yeah. And so what I'm seeing with video, what I'm thinking about with video is, of course, video doesn't in some way give you embodiment. I mean, we could even easily list senses like smell and touch, many kinesthetic senses, dynamics of force, which are crucial in martial arts and other fields, which are don't come through the video. I mean, in a very concrete way, the video, and I'm thinking about audiovisuality, it has a way of recording sound, and not all sound necessarily, but a big aspect of sound. It has a way of recording image, but moving image. And I'm just saying this kind of as if in a way to alienate it, like it has a way of recording moving image. Isn't that amazing? It can do that. Of course, it can't record all images, then it's not giving you necessarily 2 dimensions. And then, of course, there's technologies now where it's like, well, what if it is 3-dimensional, or what if it's 360 degrees? Those are all interesting, but I'm actually really, because what I'm interested in is partly to do with the ubiquity and the accessibility of the technology. I think that obviously film has been around for more than 100 years, but the bulk of that time, the power dynamics and the economics of film, not unlike the beginning of writing, it's accessible only to a certain very small number of people, and it requires a huge infrastructure in order to, so the conversation is just much narrower, as with the beginning of printing the Bible, like you're just going to get the Bible. Then later, and you don't, you know, there's a long distance between that moment of printing and the kind of flow of printing that now defines, for example, the university. So if we think of video in that way, we're not getting embodiment in this kind of, in the sense of life at all, but we're getting different mode of thinking, like, because here I am, and you see my face, you see my movement, you see what I'm wearing, and you hear the tone of my voice. So also my words are not in the way that they are as written words. They're in a very different way. And there are many things that you lose from the written word and other things that you gain. I mean, there's no desire to make a hierarchy. But in terms of kind of structural hierarchy, thinking of the journal, yeah, so the journal publishes video essays, which then they're peer reviewed, so they're video articles. And for me, one of the crucial questions, the most important questions, is what is the way, what are the techniques in which text and writing are integrated into the video, and also words, all kinds of words. So one thing that's interesting, okay, from each video article, we always make a transcript. And the transcript is there so that the writing technology, that the words can be searchable by search engines and also accessibility tools that might read the texts out loud. Some things in the video are words and they can just be transcribed, and other things are not, and they would have to be described. But the things that are words are both things that are printed. So if I put text on the screen, that easily transcribed, but also if I speak, some of the speech can be transcribed. That is, the words, the aspect, you know, it's a very hard thing to shift the way of thinking about it, but I'm trying to go the other direction. The thing in my speech that can be transcribed is whatever you can transcribe. It's the technology of writing coming back towards so some aspects of what's in the video can be transcribed, and then the rest can't. And the question that's really fascinating for me at the moment is what are those different relationships between textuality and audiovisuality? So for example, voiceover is very commonly used, and in the journal there's a lot of voiceover. You see the image of somebody doing something, practicing, exploring, moving, or you see other kinds of illustrations, and someone is speaking about it. Sure, makes sense. But there are other possibilities as well. Text can be on screen, text can be scrolling, there can be long periods without text, without speech. How long can you go without any words, without any speech, in the context of an academic article? Can you have an academic article, potentially, we don't have anything like this yet, where the only text is, let's say, the minimal text. So let's say we're gonna, because it's a journal, because the whole architecture of journal systems is based, of course, on text, there's gonna be a title, there's gonna be an author name or author names, an abstract, and keywords. But what if that's it? Can there be then 20 minutes of audiovisuality where there's no words appearing? We don't have anything like that yet. I mean, so far there's a lot of words, a lot of text, so there's no question of getting rid of text. But the text is not framing. And one of the things that we've come to in the journal is that there's no text outside the video, in the sense that you're not allowed to, there's no scope for including a separate written statement, which people often ask, like, can I also include a written statement? Mm-hmm. And I say, no, but you can put the written statement in the video. So, you know, if you want to read you can read a statement, you can have the text scroll, you can put text in the video, but the video is the outer frame. So it's I think it's a kind of topology of knowledge or topology of rhetorics that where I feel like I'm able to ask and play with and explore what text is and what kinds of knowledge and meaning we share through text, because it's inside of this other kind of form which can hold a lot of text, actually. I mean, right now we're sitting there, we're barely moving, and it's just text, words. But there's also more, because you do see my hands moving, you hear my voice. There's a whole other dimension. But if we transcribe, if we transcribe this conversation, you would get a lot of the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, you wouldn't quite get the feeling of Paul and the feeling of Ben, but you would get a lot. Whereas if we were practicing martial arts together and you transcribed it, you wouldn't get the same. So it's a kind of experimental space to think about these modes of communication.
Yeah. So to translate that into I want to move the conversation along a little bit, but I think the linking theme for me is you're interested in ways that different media, different technologies can capture something of a present or of a scene. Because when we live in the present, that's a big theme throughout that book, isn't it? The idea of within the theatre and artistic and performance realms, people fetishize the impossibility of capturing the artistic moment, and the artistic moment as something that is, you don't think this, other people have argued, is by definition unique. And your argument is, no, it's not unique. It's just that you can't capture it because we haven't got the, and it's a product of levels of training and different, so many factors that defy any one technology. So if we were immersed in technologies that could capture, that could somehow really put us into that situation again, really capture it, it would be repeatable. So that's there's a huge set of issues there that, and most of which probably all of which I completely agreed with you in the book, and I think it was completely fascinating and a little bit definitely mind expanding to read your book when I first did in 2015. But I want to move it on to something that me and Ben Judkins were discussing last week or the week before. So I had Ben Judkins here and here, and we were discussing aspects of your chapter on yoga. And I'm thinking about the notion of capture. So you argue in the book, in the chapter on yoga, that many physical practices today from all over the world, whether that be yoga or martial arts or dance, have been forced into or appropriated by or captured by what you call a kind of athleticism, sort of a healthism paradigm. And healthism isn't health. It's not coextensive and completely encompassing of all possible definitions of health. Healthism is a paradigm that prioritizes the athletic, the youthful, the muscular, the lean, and you contrast that with a somatic paradigm, like you're just doing something for the feel of it. That's a different paradigm altogether. And Ben Judkins proposed that you kind of were simplifying things and saying that was always the case. Now, my response to him was, no, when I read the book, I thought you were talking about historical process. So that Western media culture today is dominated by this, what we might call an essentially simplistic type of vanity and narcissism that's dominated by visual images of youthful athletic prowess, whether that be big biceps or whether that be, shiny skin or something. So have that process of capture, is that a Western thing? Is the healthist paradigm new? Is it Western? Or is that itself dominated by a technology, the way that I have proposed or I've read and other people have proposed, and I keep saying it, you can connect the emergence of bodybuilding with the emergence of photography, for instance. So what made healthism? Where did it come from? What made that? Was it the technology? Was it what was it, do you think?
Well, let me unpack a few things. I mean, first I want to say that I think that aspect of that chapter is probably, it's a little bit, in a way, it's a little bit secondary to my main argument. And so, and also it's not the kind of the main aspect that I've been focused on since then. So I don't feel quite, I want to kind of hedge a little bit and say, in terms of a large historical or political claim, especially historical, I'd probably defer to historians to some degree. But I do have a few thoughts. I mean, first of all, I don't think healthism is just one thing. I think for sure it's at least two things. And they very much have to do with technologies. Because for sure so the main thing about healthism, I think, that we could think about socially and politically is that it's individualist. But there's at least two different ways of at least two different kinds of healthism which are somehow related but very different, and they're very different technologies, because you're referring to the healthism of how the body looks. And that is in some way bound up with photography in terms of its scale, for sure. That doesn't mean that there aren't many kind of histories of the idea of health that go far back beyond photography, and there are different histories of the body and different ideas of health. And in a sense, you could say probably there have always been grapplings with what does it mean to be healthy? Maybe these are kind of very broad transcultural categories. Well, what would it mean to be healthy? And if you're not healthy, what does that mean? So thinking about, for example, disability perspectives, there could be a kind of, this is very complicated. I don't want to set it up too much as a progression, but let's say a symbolic paradigm where if you're unhealthy, that means you did something wrong. Then a medical paradigm where if you're unhealthy, it doesn't mean you did something wrong, but it means something is wrong with you. And then we can try to fix that. And a social paradigm where if you are not healthy, then the causes might be much more complex, much more dispersed, and they might not only be about you, and it might not be you who's unhealthy. So deconstructing those things. Then I think there's complexities there as well. There's disabilities that are not disabilities. There's things that are classified as not healthy that are actually not healthy. Then there's other things like pain, chronic pain, which are harder to kind of bring into a social model. So that's all very, very complex. And I guess all I would want to, so the main argument of that chapter, which is, all I would really be able to kind of make strong claims about, is just, we need to be opening up these questions. These are research questions, like what is health? How do we understand health? How do we cultivate health? How do we maybe de-individualize the cultivation of health? Because of these two dominant paradigms. So there's the kind of photographic visual paradigm where you can, as if you can tell if someone's healthy by looking at them, which today I think is probably most palpable in fat phobia, and just a kind of feeling of like, oh, if you are fat, if you see someone who's fat, it's bad, it's unhealthy, etc. How can we fix it? It's an individual issue. It's a problem. So that's a kind of visual, as if there's this visual possibility to kind of grasp this kind of idea of health, and it's very important. And also we understand it. We know what the problem is. We know, all of this kind of, so it's very strict paradigm. But the medical paradigm is a little bit different because it's not particularly visual. So if you're thinking about like statistics, population statistics, mortality statistics, that's not the same as how people look. Those can be disaggregated, but it's still a reduction. It's still a kind of simplification, and that's not to, in a way, it's not to complain about the development of medicine or the power of medicine. I mean, there's no way to kind of criticize that on a certain level, and yet it can be implemented in very reductive ways and very harmful ways. There's a book by Eli Clare on the idea of cure, and how the idea of cure can be a very violent idea. It intends to heal a problem, but it can also be extremely violent, and that goes, looking also back to Foucault, History of Madness. And so so there's different, I think healthism probably as a concept, I would say it's about reductive systems of attempting to control health, and how they can also do violence. It doesn't mean that they don't also do good, and I think it's a very complex question. So, in some way, I don't feel able to dive into the question, but I feel like as someone who's thinking about embodied research, what I can say is it's complicated, and also it's not going to be answered only through statistical measurements or kind of analysis of what's happening. It's also going to be answered, in order to really grapple with that, you're going to also need to take a practice approach, an approach of practice and experimentation. And what we find in fields of embodied research, let's say, is actually health is one of the key ways in which you can instrumentalize and make your work measurable and receive funding. I'm always talking about this kind of, if you're doing something that's the arts, you're in a certain section. If you can say that there are health benefits, you potentially have access to this massive structure. But I always feel a bit wary of it, right? It comes with a lot of strings attached because it has to be measurable in particular ways. It has to be evidenced in particular ways. It has to fit into certain paradigms. And among these is that, so those are both individualist paradigms though. They're both, in both cases, the question of health is, are you healthy as a person? Let me look at you. I got you. Here's your body. I have it. You know, whether it's a medical analysis, I have it, or a photographic analysis, I have it. I got it. There it is. Healthy or not, you know, more healthy, less healthy. That's the question. And that's not the only way we could think about health. And if we were thinking in terms of embodied practices and various cultural practices that are not even associated with health, but are clearly, I mean, it's interesting how people are, there's often a study that will say like, look, we discovered that, for example, this one narrow kind of dance is good for you. It's good for your health because we measured it. And when people did this dance, they were healthier and they were happier. And it's like, well, okay, yes, that's probably true. It might be true of all dances. And you know what? It might be equally true of singing. Like you less often, you know, you hear people kind of fretting, for example, that they don't move enough. But you don't have, people don't worry in the same way that they're not singing enough. It's not, I don't think it actually, you know, I think to some degree we're just not seeing the picture of like practice and embodiment and like, you know, what is it that's actually healthy here? Isn't it kind of, we might figure it as play or community or interaction or relations to the earth and to land.
There's so much to say about that. I mean, there's some trivial, jokey, anecdotal things that I want to say, and some bigger things. I'll chuck in a couple of trivial things. My wife worries if she doesn't sing enough, because she worries that it means she's sad, right? And it does. It basically does, right? But and anyway, that's different. And the other thing is, when I'm talking about measuring things, you know, you watch these programs about, they normally come on in January after New Year's Eve and everything, and it's like scientifically, like, is this good for you? Which is better to do, like high reps or low reps? And it's, so they do these like 8-week-long tests, and they go, well, the people who did 100 reps put on just as much money as the people who did as weight as the people who did 10 reps. And you're like, yeah, but your body responds to everything. If you haven't done it before and you do anything, it changes. The body changes in response to the forces that it's subject to. Those are the very trivial things. More seriously, when you're describing the visual individualist, you say individualist, healthist paradigm, it was making me think of the kind of, you know, eugenic phrenology kind of approach. Like, I talk to the students a bit about phrenology and the idea that the fantasy that you could measure and map the visual appearance of a body and then determine whether that person was going to be a criminal or, you know, so 19th century scientists, in inverted commas, would be measuring, you know, bone structures of criminals and of Africans and of Asians and of the Irish and so on and so on and so on, in order to try and type, to develop types. So I wonder if I'm leading up here to your arguments about decolonial or decolonizing embodiment, because it seems like, although you say there's an individualism to it, it seems to be perilously close to a kind of imposed, simplistic, universalistic kind of judgments, like a hierarchy. Like, this person has the right body image. They are a good, you know, I'm thinking American Psycho. You know, this is like, you know, you can always be thinner. You can always do more crunches. You can always do more press-ups. And I'm wondering to what extent that relates to your recent arguments about decolonizing embodiment and the racial, cultural, class politics to the body and the images of the body.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I mean, for sure, the technological and epistemological developments of these things are deeply part of the history of racism and colonialism. Those measurements of the body, those classifications of the body. Yeah, I think that I think individualism is compatible with, in some way, with the kind of universalism that you're referring to, because it doesn't mean necessarily real individual autonomy. or real individual health, whatever that might be. It means the individual as a unit that can be measured. For example, by establishing how healthy it is, or how moral it is, or something like that, or how even how human it is. And so those histories are the same in some way. I think I didn't really understand that to the same degree when I was writing What a Body Can Do. And I mean, What a Body Can Do is, you know, it structurally integrates thinking about gender. And that's because that's a much deeper kind of work in me. It mentions in that chapter also that it's possible to also think about race potentially and other identity categories, ethnicities and nationalities in that way. But it doesn't kind of structurally integrate that, and it doesn't go deep into it. And I don't think it has a good handle on it. That's very much what I'm trying to think about these days, and in a way since then. And it means grappling with the kind of whiteness of the institutions in which I'm also working, including like where I wrote the dissertation and where I published the book and where I'm teaching now, and the kind of this conception of academia and the way that knowledges are created there and the people who are there and the power structures, in order to think about, okay, technique. I mean, it also, well, let me go back before that. It also means to think about the whiteness of the situations that were leading me to think about technique in this way. So making this bridge, when I said making a bridge between these different worlds, there's these different worlds which were in a way kind of modeling mind and body, or theory and practice. They were both predominantly white worlds in New York City. And so they had certain kinds of limitations as well. And when I think about what those spaces of embodied practice are doing, I mean, a lot of those spaces of embodied practice have, in the same period that I've been grappling in this way, have been kind of grappling with their own whiteness, compelled to look at their whiteness and say, what are we doing here? And there's this navigation that's going on that has to do with rethinking what were the ethics and politics of working with the body in the first place. What was this call to, what, like this idea that there's a kind of politics of embodiment or reclaiming of embodiment in these predominantly white spaces, or all white spaces, or very white spaces. I'm also thinking of the theater companies that I worked in before then, although it's different, but it's this very European, that's a European context of whiteness. There's a lot of knowledge that's coming from colonized contexts, and is deeply informing the ethics of the practice and the aims of the practice. So like the practices, I mean, like at the very beginning when I said that the theater I was working in, there was drawing on yoga, there was drawing on martial arts, also a lot of drawing on various song traditions, which are called folk song traditions, but in a lot of cases they could also be called indigenous song traditions. And so there's this huge flow of knowledge that's coming in, which is wrestling now, I think, with this very intense, important question of appropriation, which gets flattened, I think, a lot in the public conversation around appropriation, because of the extremely high stakes and the narrow focus that gets put on it with these massive stakes on a very small example. It's very hard to have that conversation. But actually, I think the conversation is about recognizing these flows of knowledge and saying, actually, these other ways of thinking about embodiment, or even other ways of thinking about health, these are coming from actually other cultural contexts, which have been colonized, which have been racialized, which are still being colonized in various ways, still being marginalized, still being violently oppressed in many ways, and subject to injustice, as we're even seeing in the current pandemic very starkly, more starkly even than before, which was already very stark. So I'm interested in thinking of it in terms of kind of obligation. I don't have a good word for it yet. Is it obligation? Is it responsibility? Is it duty? But it's sort of like as you come to see that there are these flows of knowledge, and I don't just mean the theater companies, but also even the dance training that I did before that, or just these kind of little places where things were appearing to me, which became this this search for what I then called embodiment, and became this kind of other idea of health, and became this idea of embodied research, and became this kind of hope for an ethics of audiovisuality. All of that does have links with kind of song traditions, movement traditions, and those are precisely the things that are colonized to different degrees. I mean, even within Europe, there's there's colonization of European indigenous traditions. And so those knowledges, like there's a lot of reclaiming of those knowledges. There's a huge desire to reclaim them. There's a desire to, but it's so complicated because they can be reclaimed in a way that appropriates them, in a way that instrumentalizes them back into the kind of dominant paradigms of health, in a way that certainly doesn't change distribution of power. I mean, in the article that I think you're referring to about notes, which is just notes for decolonizing embodiment, I start the section on decolonization with Eve Tuck and Wayne K. Yang's article, which is called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which is essentially when we talk about decolonization, we should be talking about land transfer to indigenous nations, basically. And we shouldn't be using decolonization as if it can mean social justice, or as if it could mean, for example, gender politics divorced from a much larger politics of political decolonization. So for me, the question is about what is that relationship between decolonization in a political sense, which requires conversations between nations or sovereign things that have control over land, and other forms of decolonization or decoloniality, where we're talking about what we understand as our body, as our embodiment. So how we understand our bodies and our beings, our living beingness, in flows of race and flows of gender and flows as well as of class and nation, and these different language, these different things that configure. How do these things intersect in us, and they place us in these power structures, but we also work with them, and all of the flows of communication around them are not simply reenactments of power structures. They're struggles, they're constant struggles. So I think this is the path that I'm going on. I mean, I think for me, technique is still an important idea in thinking about all that, because it still, for me, gets at something about it. Somehow it's cutting through some of the, not just mind, body, but also like structure and agency, material and cultural, like, yeah, what matters actually is ways of doing things, pathways that are to some degree repeatable and shareable. And that does mean technologies, but it doesn't only mean technologies, because there's no technologies without living bodies. So it also means ways that we are ourselves. And there's, that intersects with so many areas of thought and culture. So it's still a really useful perspective for me, but I think I don't anymore. In What a Body Can Do, I was really trying to isolate technique in a way. And in my recent work, and this has to do with the role of video, I've been thinking about the relations of technique, identity, and place. That is, those terms are informed by readings in critical race theory, critical race studies, indigenous theory, indigenous politics, about place and identity. But also linking to technique, because we're not only place and we're not only identity, but we're also not only technique. We're not only kind of what we consciously cultivate. We are interweaving these things, and those things are in a way different levels, or Deleuze would say different speeds of things. So that's kind of where I'm currently thinking, is putting technique in relation to identity and place, and seeing how technique is of place, and technique constructs identity, but also arises out of identity. And I think the ethics and politics of technique then can't really be about isolating technique. I mean, I think I was still at that time writing What a Body Can Do, still very much in what I'm thinking now as this kind of, it's almost like, when I'm starting to think about it as almost like a critical whiteness studies that doesn't know that it's a critical whiteness studies. that's actually like these practices that I'm referring to are in fact trying to decolonize themselves, but without an awareness of the political landscape, often without an awareness, like they're not intentionally colonial actions. It's not like I'm going to go take your song and then you won't have it. It's just the opposite, actually. It's like, let me take your song and your song will live, and that will also mutually support you. So it's not a colonial action in that way, but it's cut off from a politics. So it's also not like, may I have your song and let's be in solidarity. It's not that either. It's like, it's about the song, which is beautiful. So it's about the technique. But I think now for me, it's kind of like, okay, those ties need to be remade. And technique can be a starting point for remaking those ties and saying these techniques link us at the level of identity, and then beyond that, at the level of place, where we are and where we've been and where we come from. And if we can connect those threads, maybe we have some kind of understanding of kind of what we're doing, but in context.
Okay, that was an incredibly expansive answer. And when you began talking about that, I was going to pose a question, but you actually answered it completely fully in the process of not of me not having imposed it yet, because I was thinking about from the idea of colonizing, things being colonized and things being decolonized. I was thinking of the way in which certain movements and certain kind of body postures and body transitions and so on are connected with power and class. So, I mean, the first thing that popped into my head was, the early 20th century British English martial art of Bartitsu was very gentlemanly martial art. It was about like how Victorian gentlemen could defend themselves against thugs and hooligans and the Irish and the colonial subjects that they were meant to be in charge of. And it's the Sherlock Holmes martial art. That's the martial art, and it's very, very elegant. And you behave like a gentleman, even though you're fighting. You fight in an elegant way, and that led me to thinking about gender and the performance of gender. So the way a man walks, the way an arrogant man walks, or a bit. And I was thinking, is it possible to take one of those, any technique, or that technique of posture, that technique of movement or of using your voice, which might be associated with masculinity or upper class or superior something, is it possible to decolonize that? But then you went on to answer it by saying that you really need to kind of triangulate. It's not just about the technique, it's about the technique in a place, who is commanding it, and whether that command is subverting or enriching or strengthening a kind of a hierarchy. The other I was thinking of two other things. One was, a student was just asking me about James Bond and wants to do a kind of semiotic analysis of the performance of masculinity in James Bond. And I was wondering whether, you could, ironically, the way that Judith Butler would once talk about like parodic performance of that, whether that would somehow subvert or transform either masculinity away from its older forms to different forms of performance. It's an incredibly complicated thing, and I'm looking at the clock. So, I mean, so you're now arguing that you can't take one thing like technique. It has to be triangulated, has to be given a place, has to be thinking about in terms of a position, or maybe a hierarchy, or maybe what Stuart Hall would have called conjunctural analysis. You have to, well, this is about capture again, isn't it? You can't just take the one thing, technique, the written word, the audiovisual. You have to try and do a conjunctural analysis of where the technique is being deployed, practiced, expanded.
Well, something that's interesting about video, more than interesting, something that's been really, again, going back to how thinking about video as thought has changed my understanding, is that you can't have the technique in video by itself. I mean, I guess you could have a drawing of it, but when you make a video of someone demonstrating a technique, their identity and the place is also present. You might not be able to identify it, to know. I mean, you might see the place and not know where it is, but it has this concreteness where it's quite often it is. So watching video like of someone's practice, you can see their identity in some ways, and you can see their place in some ways, and it's so different than writing again. You know, the way that words kind of can float around and be so detached, and then in writing, you know, there's a movement that's related to, I think, I don't know if it kind of is first in feminism, but it's a very important feminist theory movement that's now also much more widespread, where you try to put in words who you are as part of the argument. So, you know, before you make your argument, you say, as, you know, I speak from this position, you situate yourself, you position yourself, and that's part of the argument. But of course you have to do that in words. And it's just it's a different thing. You're present in a different way in video. Yeah. So, but I'm not saying that you can't only focus on technique. I mean, I think it's, you know, the What a Body Can Do was about the fact that technique is fields, and it's fields of knowledge. And so when you work in songs, when you work with movements, with areas of movement and practice, you can dwell in them very, very deeply. There is stuff there. There's a whole world inside of something like breath or balance or pitch, melody. So one can dwell in those things, and I think that's really important. I think part of why it's important is because of the relations that those dwellings have with the people who are doing that dwelling, and the communities that support that dwelling. Because that possibility of dwelling in song or dwelling in movement is always supported by a community of practice, and that community is supported by a place or land. And so it's not that you can't go into that. It's almost like I mean, for me, I would almost say it's a joy and it's a pleasure, and it's a culmination of aliveness. I mean, I'm reading Hasonen's book on sex as play. And there's also like, it's just another kind of extraordinary culmination and joyfulness and enjoyment of life to dwell in embodied practices. But what I'm wondering is if there is how do we figure the obligation and the duty and the responsibility that comes along with that dwelling through the layers of communities of practice and other communities and lands and places and all these infrastructures that allow for that dwelling.
Okay. Well, I think that the one question we're left with at the end of this this lesson, this discussion, is what haven't we discussed? I mean, we've discussed everything. So I think I'm just going to say, Ben Spatz, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.